I'm Tracy Day, and I am co-founder and CEO of the World Science Festival, and I'm thrilled to be here with very distinguished scientists to talk about life out there. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit and just talk about the fact that over the course of many centuries, the question of cosmic uniqueness has been an ever-evolving subject. There was a time when we thought the Earth was unique, that it was the center of the universe. Then Copernicus argued that the Earth is not the center of it all, but is one of a handful of planets going around the sun, with the sun at the center of it all. But then we realized that the sun was merely one of more than 100 billion stars in the galaxy. And this pattern of Copernican demotion has continued as we've learned that our galaxy is but one of more than 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe. In recent years, the Copernican shift in status has continued anew. Sure, there are many, many stars in the universe, but for a long time, one could have imagined that our planetary system, a collection of planets orbiting our star, was a uniquely distinguishing characteristic of our cosmic neighborhood. But observational data, as we will discuss here today, is now showing definitively that it's not the case. There are, in fact, many planets orbiting other stars, and there is now reason to believe that planetary systems orbiting stars are commonplace throughout the universe, which takes us to the focus of this panel. Might it be that our solar system is unique in that on at least one of its planets there is life? And more than that, on one of those planets there is intelligent life. Is this a final bastion of uniqueness? Or will the Copernican pattern continue? Is life a unique characteristic here on planet Earth? Is life a one-off chance occurrence? Or is life commonplace throughout the universe? And most importantly, if life is commonplace, what about intelligent life? So here we are with very distinguished panelists. I'd like to introduce them now. Cassie Conley has served as the NASA Planetary Protection Officer since 2006. Agents J and K notwithstanding, this means, in short, that Cassie is a woman in black. Her charge is to ensure that planetary exploration does not yield cross-planetary contamination, allowing us to retain the capability of discovering life in the solar system without simply finding ourselves. Prior to being appointed, Dr. Conley's research at NASA Ames Research Center focused on the biochemistry and evolution of muscle tissue, and she is well known for extensive research on how life responds to extreme environments. Her experiment focusing on how nematode worms adapt to microgravity flew on the last mission of the Space Shuttle Columbia. And after the tragic accident, her experiments were recovered, revealing that the animals were still alive, a finding of considerable relevance to planetary protection. Dr. Conley did her postdoctoral work at Scripps and received a PhD in plant biology from Cornell University. Dimitar Sasselov studies stars and planets at Harvard University, where he is a professor of astronomy. His research explores modes of interaction between light and matter. He and his team discovered several planets orbiting other stars with novel techniques he hopes to use to find planets like Earth. His new book, The Life of Super-Earths, describes the renewed search for life on other planets. He is the founding director of the Harvard Origins of Life Initiative, a cross-disciplinary research effort bridging the physical and life sciences. He was a senior science advisor for the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study in Harvard and a member of the Global Agenda Council on Space Security at the World Economic Forum. Professor Sasselov has a PhD in physics from Sophia University, followed by his PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto. Welcome to you both. Before we get to the search for life, I'm wondering if we can talk about all the excitement about the explosion of the number of planets that we have recently become aware of. Is that something that you could talk about?
Yes, it has happened only recently. It's something which many in the community I come from consider a breakthrough moment in the history of astronomy. One is similar to what happened about 400 years ago, when we first realized how much bigger the universe was and how Earth was one of a multitude of other planets. But for those 400 years, we had no evidence for that. It was one of those things, you've seen Star Trek, you know there must be other worlds out there. But if you don't have evidence for them, there is a problem. And the problem is that you cannot study them, and you have no idea what they are all about. And we've crossed that threshold in the last couple of years, and literally in the last 6 months, of now having a fairly good idea, both that the number of planets orbiting other stars that are somewhat similar to the Earth is very large, actually much larger than we anticipated, that many of those, as a result of that, many of those planets are very close to us in the cosmic sense, in our neighborhood, and that we have a wonderful golden opportunity to now start exploring them for the next big holy grail of this search, which is there life on them? And most of that has come from the NASA space mission Kepler, which recently, last month, completed 4 years in space doing these studies.
Do you have a sense of numbers?
I
mean, are we
8 months ago, I gave a talk like that, including to my students, and I told them the number of planets which are potentially habitable like the Earth in our galaxy alone, in the Milky Way galaxy, is about 100 million, 100 million, which at the time I was boasting as being a very large number. Today I have to tell you that, somewhat embarrassingly, that the new number has increased from 100 to 500 and maybe close to 800 million. So the number has increased significantly, which I have to warn you though, the galaxy is a big place. So 500 million planets still means that they're not really that close to us. But actually, from astronomical terms, they are. It actually means that there's probably a planet like the Earth within about 20 light years from us, which is really close when you think about the size of the galaxy, which is more like 100,000 light years across.
What do we know about what conditions are required for a planet to be habitable? Either one of you both know the answer, no doubt.
Well, it depends what kind of chemistry you're looking for. If you're looking for chemistry like we have on Earth that makes up us, then it would be physical conditions that allow liquid water, that allow for carbon-based chemical reactions to take place. And the range of locations around a star where that might take place are something that Dimitar can certainly answer much better. But looking for life is a challenge, partly because we have to identify first what it is that we're looking for.
So in a sense, I think Cassie would agree that both of us don't know the answer. And the reason for that is we only have one example of life. Yeah. But both of us know what we ought to do in order to find it. And that is exactly the conditions to find places with the conditions that Cassie already described. Sometimes we call it the Goldilocks zone planets, or call it the habitable zone planets. That's the most practical way for us to go forward and do something which I would consider one of the holy grails of humankind science, to accomplish the answer to that question, which is the topic of our discussion today: are we alone? So I think those conditions are our current goal of how to practically achieve that. It will be a tragedy, though, if we turns out that we are very narrow-minded about it and we do not do our homework and try to find out what are the other possibilities. And ironically, this is homework that we should do at home, that is in our labs. We don't need to go necessarily to the nearest stars with our biggest telescopes to study that. And that's the kind of work that both Cassie and a lot of my colleagues are doing here in our labs, to find out what are the other microorganisms, the nematodes that survived the Columbia crash. We may not know what the limits of life are, and I think we don't yet know what the limits of life are. So that's where our next big challenge is.
But in terms of the origin of life, you know, as you said, even knowing the origin of life on Earth in order to inform the search for life in the universe, how are we doing that?
Well, it's actually very difficult to study the origin of life on Earth because our ancestors, over time, have eaten the evidence, in effect. Dead bodies are food for subsequent generations, and so on Earth we have eaten our own ancestors, and therefore we cannot study ourselves. In addition, of course, the geology of the planet Earth is such that the surface of the Earth gets recycled. And in fact, the presence of life on Earth has changed the physics and the chemistry of Earth down into the core of the planet because of the production of oxygen. The Earth is a highly chemically reactive planet, and therefore that reactivity has changed also the environment of the Earth such that the early conditions on Earth are not the same, were not the same as they are now. In fact, we don't even really understand what the differences are. The Urey-Miller experiments, in which they put together a methane atmosphere and ran electricity through it, was one example of trying to understand the basic chemistry that might have created life early in the Earth's evolution. But even there, it's not clear that we understood the conditions correctly. And so when we're looking for life, indications of life on other planets, that becomes a very interesting opportunity.
Can we jump ahead to where we're looking? Besides the, you know, the telescopes, but actually on Mars. How are we, and Cassie, it would be great if you could talk about what you're doing in terms of trying to preserve and protect our, you know, scientific investigation on Mars and other planets.
Absolutely. So one of the characteristics of life is that it replicates. And so the range of organisms that we have on Earth range from things living deep in the subsurface, living off the radioactive decay of the rocks, all the way to organisms that survive in the atmosphere, floating several kilometers above the solid surface of the Earth. And this range of environments provides a range of capabilities for Earth organisms. It's unreasonable to expect that if we go to another planet, we would see less capable life. So understanding the range of life on Earth allows us to also have a set of parameters for which we would look for life, for example, on Mars. The subsurface of Mars is probably not very different than the subsurface of Earth, so that represents a potential habitat. The environment of Mars has changed over time. In the distant past, it was thought that Mars was much more wet. There were indications that there was water flowing on the surface. It would have been warmer, it would have had a thicker atmosphere, and therefore the conditions on Mars might have been more similar to conditions that we have on Earth today, and in that case be more hospitable to life that is like Earth. This presents both an opportunity and a challenge in that in that we know that meteorite impacts on one planet eject material that then can get transferred to another planet. So we have meteorites from Mars falling to Earth. They take a very long time to get here, but that also identifies a possibility for meteorites from Earth to get transferred to Mars. And in that process of transfer, unfortunately, my experiment on the Columbia shuttle did demonstrate that animals even can survive at least one step of that transfer. So that also elevates the concern for studying life on Mars, because it could look like us, it could be related to us. We might be Martians. And so that makes
not new, but fascinating.
That makes a really difficult problem. If we're actually related, then determining the difference, I mean, it's very easy to find life on Mars. All we have to do is bring it with us. So
not quite the answer you want.
That's not really the answer we're looking for, but it is unfortunately something that we have done in past life detection missions. One of the Viking instruments detected what they thought at the time was cleaning fluids from the preparations of that spacecraft before it was launched to Mars. So studying life on other planets with instrumentation that we send there is actually a challenge. But yeah, I'll let you go back to.
Well, no, I just thought of an interesting thought here. The most important reason why we need to protect life on Mars is because that may be our grandmother that we're talking about.
It's quite possible.
Explain that if you would.
I
mean, you know, how that might have happened and how we are all Martians.
There was a window of opportunity. We know life on Earth. We have evidence for life on Earth as far back as there are rocks in which that evidence could be preserved. And then beyond that, 3.8 billion years ago, the rock record is thinning out and disappearing altogether because of the recycling that happens on Earth. But there was a window of opportunity during that early life of the planet Earth that mirrors the window of opportunity which was on the early Mars. And maybe early Mars was actually better off when it comes to emergence of life than the Earth. So that period in which there was a lot of material running around and hitting the planets in the solar system back 4 billion years ago brought a lot of that Martian material to Earth. And so the chemistry, which we call life, emerged on Mars, was transplanted on Earth. Mars is a smaller planet. It lost its atmosphere, didn't have magnetic field, became inhospitable, while Earth was really the planet which gave a true home to that baby from Mars to grow to what we have today. And Mars, unfortunately, is a desert planet today, while Earth is thriving. So that's very possible, and hopefully we will be able to answer that question one day by finding something on Mars which either refutes it or confirms it. And so that's why we need people like Cassie to make sure we do that.
At the moment, obviously, we have sent probes to Mars and we're investigating things there. How soon will we be bringing stuff from Mars back here to investigate and learn from those samples?
One of my colleagues started working for NASA during the Viking program, just before the Viking program. And so when Viking in 1975 was prepared to launch to Mars, it was expected that sample return from Mars was about 10 years out. In the 1980s, we had a major study looking at the potential for returning samples from Mars, and at that point it was concluded that sample return is about 10 years out. In the 1990s, we had a similar phenomenon. In the 2000s, we had a similar phenomenon, and in 2011, it was thought that, oh wow, NASA and the European Space Agency are working together, and sample return is 15 years out. Maybe that's a good sign. It didn't turn out that way. So sample return from Mars has actually been identified by the National Research Council, the Space Studies Board, as the highest priority science to be done in the decade from 2013 to 2023. Unfortunately, budgetary constraints suggest that that may not be as straightforward as one might hope for, but certainly there are studies being in process at NASA and also jointly with European Space Agency and other space agencies looking at what we can do, at least to prepare to eventually bring samples back from Mars. Returning samples from Mars to Earth raises a lot of questions about planetary protection, and to describe planetary protection, I always like to use the example of the War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds is a story about an ancient and advanced civilization that is living on a dying planet, and this planet is undergoing worse conditions, so this civilization decides that it needs to find somewhere else to live. And it looks out in the solar system, can't get to other stars yet, and it identifies this lovely, nice, warm green planet that looks potentially like a really good place to move to. Of course, that civilization sends colonists, and initially the colonists are successful and they start releasing their organisms that they need to change the planet to be the conditions that they like. But then the organisms that were already present on that planet start fighting back. And the colonists begin getting sick. And this disease is so mysterious that nobody on the home planet can actually figure out how to cure it. And tragically, the decision is made that they have to leave the colonists on the colony planet and let them all die. This is, of course, the War of the Worlds from the standpoint of the Martians, but it's an important consideration that if we go other places, we will bring our own organisms with us. We may overprint the life that's already present there by the introduction of Earth organisms. And then, of course, if there are organisms present on these other locations, they might actually be hazardous to us. And therefore, we need to be very careful in those interactions to ensure that we don't allow contact with something that we don't understand and really don't want to bring home. For planetary protection, of course, we also have the challenge of public communication, which is one of the reasons I'm here today, because there was a broadcast by Orson Welles on Halloween night in 1938. Haven't had 2038 yet. But Orson Welles designed this broadcast such that it appeared to be a real news story and not just a radio play. And there were people listening on the east coast of the United States. He'd transplanted the War of the Worlds from England to New Jersey. But the listeners of that radio play didn't realize, some of them, that this was actually a story. They thought it was real news announcements, and there were people who threw up everything and actually ran away from New York City. There was a fellow who sold the money that he was saving to buy new shoes in order to catch a train and get out of town because he thought the Martians were coming. This actually was the only lawsuit that Orson Welles paid off on after the fact, because he felt sorry for the guy who didn't have new shoes. So that identifies both the challenges in public communication about activities of space exploration, but also the concerns that the public has and the responses that the public might have, which aren't necessarily rational on the basis of a misunderstanding of information or perhaps information that's presented in a skewed way. And all of that comes in to the challenge, to be part of the challenges of performing planetary protection correctly in the context of all the other activities that humans want to do.
So everyone's here to talk about intelligent life or to hear about intelligent life, so we'll get there in a second. But I just want to ask you one question. You're trying to form new forms of life, as you say, in the laboratory here, so that you recognize it out there, correct? I mean, you said to me one of the greatest concerns you have is we'll stumble upon life, a form of life, not intelligent life, obviously, and we won't recognize it. And so the work you're doing here, also in terms of public information, is something that you, I know, want to help people understand.
Indeed. I probably should lay the case a little bit clearer here. When we explore Mars and the solar system, we have the luxury of bringing samples back, or at least even going there. When we try to detect life, and now, as I told you, we have a golden opportunity to detect the presence of life on nearby planetary systems similar to ours, we are doing it by remote sensing and by the effect a living biosphere has on the geochemistry of a planet. The same way as we've learned from the history of life on our planet. It transforms the surface of the planet, literally, changes the chemistry of the atmosphere, releases gases in the atmosphere, which may be trace gases, but which are detectable from hundreds of light years away. We know how to do this. What we don't know how to do is we don't know exactly what to look for. We know how to find a carbon copy, the pun is intended here, a carbon copy of Earth life as we know it today. And maybe as it used to be a few billion years ago here on this planet. But if there is a variety of possible chemistries which underlie the diversity of life, of what we call life, then we are going to miss the train completely. We are going to be staring at it and not knowing what we are looking at. And that is probably the biggest tragedy of humankind, to be at the threshold of one of the biggest discoveries in its history and not to recognize it for generations to come. So that is where our homework is to find out what are the limits and the possibilities for what we call biochemistry at the chemistry level, not at the level of plants and animals. And in order to do that, we need to do it in the lab, and we do it with the modern techniques of chemistry. It is not literally creating what you would call living critters running around the lab. Rather, it's creating chemical systems which mimic all the functions of what we call a living cell. We call it an artificial minimal cell. And those techniques are very powerful for telling us what are the limits of those systems, because you can subject them to different planetary environments and see the response right away, as opposed to microbes or other living forms that we already have on Earth, which respond in their own way, which tells you more about their heritage of 4 billion years of Darwinian evolution, which is encoded in their DNA, rather than telling you anything about what are the limits of life that is emerging from chemistry on a planet. And that research is ongoing now. It doesn't fit into any of the standard fields of science because it's a very collaborative research. And literally at this point, most of it is only funded privately because although many of our federal agencies would like to fund some of this research, they can't find the pigeonhole for it. They don't know what to call it. So that is essentially where this is going on, and I would like to see this continue because that's our opportunity to answer a big question.
And you're at your institute
in
at
our
Harvard,
institute, that's what we're trying to do. And again, Harvard as a private entity is funding this, right. And there are some private donors who do that, just because everybody is excited about it, but they still cannot figure out where this is going.
Right, right.
It's really a new field in a sense.
So can we jump way, way ahead to the question of intelligent life?
Yes.
And what do you think? What do you think?
Well, I believe it was Epicurus who said that if it would be as ridiculous to assume that there wasn't life around other stars as it is to think that you could throw a field of seeds, throw a handful of seeds into a field and that none of them would grow. I don't necessarily think, given the range of space and time that we observe in the universe and our current understanding of physics, that we'll ever be able to communicate with those other organisms with intelligent life on a real-time basis, simply because it's really far away, and therefore really long time ago, whatever signals we get back. But it would be, I would be very surprised if we were unique, given how average the Earth system is looking based on observations so far.
We wouldn't be doing what we're doing with Cassie if we thought otherwise, let me tell you that. But I want to tell you that there is a step between detecting microbial life, which is what I personally am looking for on those other planets. I don't expect, actually microbes are the best little critters to detect because of the gases they produce in copious amounts. And you would say, well, who cares about some slime on Gliese 581G? Okay, I do. And do you know why? Because the big question, the big elephant in the room is, are we alone? Remember, that's what we're talking about. And when we say we mean we, you and I, not we, bacteria, Ebola virus, or something like that. So there is a connection between, there is a lot of microbial life out there and intelligent life, because we have a sense, and pretty good sense, about the history of life on our planet. And we can see how inadvertently the microbial life becomes complex and eventually could create something like what we have here. But we don't know whether this is indeed the case or there is something special which we are missing. So we are scientists, and it's one thing to speculate, but we really want to know, yes, there is microbial life on any other place than the Earth, and then you can jump on and say, then there is intelligent life. And so I would argue that the moment, the historical moment when we will know the answer to the question, are we alone in the universe, is going to happen now with the detection of another microbial life, whether on another stellar system or in our solar system, and not when we kind of come together and shake hands and say, hello, how are you? Because at that moment, we will know that they're out there, and it will be just a matter of finding out. Right now, we don't know whether this is the case. I want to play, if you allow me, my role as a professor and quiz the audience. Would you allow me that for a second? Okay, I have a quiz for you. So listen carefully. Okay, so are we alone in the universe is a really clear-cut question right now. It's a binary question, they say. It's yes or no. And we will know the answer, maybe I would argue in our lifetime, whether it is a yes or a no. Okay, because we'll scan a lot of planets out there. We'll know about Mars in 30 years. We will live longer than that. And we'll know yes or no. So I want you to tell me, by show of hands, is how you personally will feel about the yes answer versus the no answer. The no answer seems very depressing, but actually also means that we are really unique, break the Copernicus mediocrity case, and say, give us some kind of responsibility. We are the ones which we are responsible for the consciousness existing in the universe. The yes answer, of course, is very nice. You know, oh, we'll have a large community of neighbors, and we'll have parties. And so think about it. Will a no answer make some of you more excited about our place in the universe? Any show of hands?
They all want alien neighbors.
No answer. we are alone in the universe. We are the only ones. We are really, we have the responsibility for really the rest. Our place in the universe is extremely significant because we are the only ones.
But that's just a tentative note, right? I mean, you can't ever prove it.
Does any of you prefer that? No, I'm saying, let's say we get there. Would you prefer that?
Could you just have a point of information, actually, what Brian said too? How could you have a definitive no?
I'm not saying I will give you a definitive answer, but if I do, would you prefer that? It's not a scientific question.
Do you want to own it all?
Yes. Does any of you feel better if the answer is no?
There's nobody else
So
out
everybody is yes. Well, let's see. Show of hands. Good. So we should do it. We should find out.
I feel safer if you're wrong.
But can I just ask a question, and then I would love to open it up for questions to all of you. So, you know, you said that the most important thing will be the discovery of microbial life. That's like the main first step. And that, are you suggesting that there is an inevitability to intelligent life once that's...
Yes. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, just to be very black and white about it. I mean, in science, we always say, well, maybe, yes, we don't know this and that. There is a lot more that we don't know about what it takes planetary chemistry to turn into life than what it takes for life to evolve into more complex forms. That second part, we know quite a bit even from the single example, but it's a single example with many possibilities, as my old mentor Stephen Jay Gould liked to show that. And these many possibilities always lead to complexity. They lead to diversity, but to complexity always.
And does complexity inevitably lead to intelligent life?
That maybe.
Maybe.
I will give the maybe answer.
To replicate what happened on Earth.
I think given the numbers, if there are 100 million living planets like the Earth in our galaxy, and given the 8 billion years of possible evolution, I think that's pretty good odds in my book.
And so to give the perspective of somebody who does study life on Earth as a biologist, if we look at the origin of microbial life, there are 3 major branches with great separation, which actually lends credence to the possibility that we know there had to be some level of separation. Maybe it was transfer from different planets. At least it was isolation for enough time to be retained now in the evolutionary record. But when we look, so that's the microbial system, and that pertained on Earth for 3 billion years-ish. But if we look at the evolution of more complex life, that happened many times on Earth. It's not an N of 1. It's an N of at least 5 and perhaps up to 20 or more. So the evolution of complexity is something that does happen often when you have living systems. The evolution of intelligence is, again, another challenge, because in order to be intelligent as we understand it, there is a requirement to respond to different situations. And so it wouldn't necessarily be expected that a plant or a fungus or an alga would develop intelligence, because those are organisms that stay in one place and they simply have to respond to all the conditions that come at them. Whereas animals have to move around and therefore have to not only encounter different situations, but can choose to encounter different situations. And that may be key for the evolution of intelligence. But again, we have only an N of 1, or a few if you count other vertebrates, or invertebrates in the case of octopi, things with complex nervous systems. So it isn't, again, we're in the sort of the statistics of very low numbers, and it's a difficult question to answer.
But I insist, we are in the statistics of number 1 for origin of life, but multiple for development of intelligence. I think some of our neighbor animals are quite intelligent.
Absolutely. Sometimes more than us.
Can we open it up for questions? People line up here. Is that the plan? Yeah. So, or you can yell. Oh, you can't yell because they're taping. So they'd like you to, if you would, go to the microphone. Intelligent life, right here. Go ahead.
If I may I ask whether you think there is intelligent life here? But I meant that in these terms. You were saying that there was something like 100 billion all those things out there. The numbers are dramatic. But don't you think these numbers would develop other forms of intelligence that would understand our intelligence, but we would never understand theirs?
Picking up on the last part of your question, the answer is yes, but the answer to the question which I was trying to answer, are we alone, is still yes, that they are very different from us, but they are out there, as opposed to all that is out there is chemistry and physics, as opposed to biology. So intelligence here on our planet is a question for debate. And I'm not equipped or competent to really enter into it. I would just say that, to me, there is a clear connection between microbes and something like animals which are able to accomplish the things which we do or have. And that is a big difference from an astronomical point of view. So just as an astronomer, to me, it's a binary case again. Origin of life, origins of cognition, two different major events which have low probability, but we don't know what that probability is.
If it was here, we wouldn't know about it.
In certain sense, I don't think so, because as far as we know, the universe that we observe, it is made of several components, and ordinary matter is the only component which is capable of chemistry. So if they are chemically based, even if that's mechanical proxies, or if you want avatars for them that are here, at some point energetically we should be able to detect such a shadow biosphere, whether it's guessed biosphere or whether it's simply an alternative that always existed here on Earth. We haven't been able to do that so far. That doesn't mean that it's not here, but there is absolutely no evidence that it is here, and the limitations are very stringent.
I can't argue with your wishes.
As scientists,
I'm happy to hear that.
as scientists, we deal with what we observe.
Yeah.
And if we can't observe it, we don't know anything about it. So, yeah.
You've just established. Go back. You can't do it.
Hi, there was a psychiatrist at Harvard about 30 years ago, Dr. John Mack. I don't know if you're familiar with his research.
I knew him, yes.
30 years ago, he was poo-pooed because he believed in extraterrestrial beings. And he interviewed these kids in South Africa who were on recess. The teachers were inside, and they were all freaked out because a spaceship landed, and they all came running into the teacher's room, and they all described the same event, and the ground was all burnt. And they said that these extraterrestrials all said the same thing, and it was beware of, and they couldn't pronounce the word technology. And years later, about 5 years ago, his girlfriend, who was with him in this study, Dominique, she went back 30 years later to interview these kids. They were now doctors and nurses and social workers and dentists and lawyers. They were still traumatized. They were still having PTSD. They couldn't hardly talk about it. They all described the same event. And the airline people, they all saw the same thing roaming around the sky. Has this taken any credence? Has this been, really explored? And have you seen the movie that Dominique was making, interviewing these people who were very credible?
So I haven't seen the movie, no, but I actually, since I had met at the time John Mack and know a little bit about this, I can tell you that as far as I'm concerned and the rest of the community, there is no credence to this. And my personal thinking about this is it is not only that we don't have evidence, but the kind of evidence that has come up through people's account does not match the space and physical constraint of the galaxy. That is, if there is indeed a civilization, technologically advanced civilization that is capable to visit us here, they have to be a lot more advanced than we are. And that means that the way they will present themselves to us is going to be in modes that we cannot comprehend quite in the same way. It's not going to look like our technology 50 years in the future, which is what most of this looks like in that purported evidence. So it's going to be more like what the previous question was. They're here, but we don't know, and we will never know because they don't even care if they're that advanced for us to know that they're here. They will control the conversation, in other words. It's going to be them controlling the conversation rather than us. And so to me, that evidence just doesn't match the sheer difficulty of getting from there to here, which we know it must be accomplished because they're not coming from Mars. They're really coming from another star.
Can I be professorial as you did before? You were asking a preference of the crowd. Would you like to know that there are neighbors out there? How many of you think there are? Not here, but how many think there are?
What? There are what?
There are, I'm sorry, there is intelligent life.
Somewhere.
Out there, somewhere out there, other than that. We are not alone. We are not alone. Intelligent life. I defer to my
Good
esteemed
question.
guest.
Well, I'll use Jill Tarter's definition of actually not intelligent life, which even some of us will agree on this planet, maybe more than one example, but technological intelligence. So the T in SETI sounds for not extraterrestrial, but technological intelligence. So one that could leave their home planet, could communicate beyond their planetary system. Would that be a good one?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in terms of detecting technological life, again, it gets back to the question of observation. Humans are very good at making observations. We're not necessarily all that good at interpreting our observations. We are very good at finding patterns. The patterns aren't necessarily real. And so the kinds of observations that are made by people who have experiences that are not explicable by our current understanding of what might be present on the Earth doesn't mean that the observations are undoubtedly what they experienced. The interpretation of those observations has a lot to do with what we don't know and our interest in finding patterns to explain things we don't know in ways that are consistent with what we want to believe. That's not something that we can address by science.
So I'll get to you in 1 second, but just since you brought up,
Yeah.
Jill Tarter, maybe communications from out there, you are very interesting in the notion of global cooperation in terms of, not messing up other planets and not messing up ours. What happens if that, in terms of global cooperation, if that signal comes in?
That's actually not something that is regulated by the UN or monitored by the UN. I'm here representing the Committee on Space Research, which is a part of the International Council for Science, which maintains the international planetary protection guidelines that all countries that signed the Outer Space Treaty have agreed to follow. That's important for science because it only takes one release of starlings in Central Park to have starlings all over the Americas. It only takes one introduction of malaria into the New World to infect all humans in the New World, to have potential for affecting the populations, all the human populations in the New World. Invasive species can be a problem. So one release can affect all of the global interest in doing future science. That's an international endeavor. That's always looking at microbial life. In the US, if we somehow get a contact from extraterrestrial life, that's not NASA's problem, that's the Air Force's problem. At the UN, we don't have the equivalent of the Air Force. So the SETI Institute actually has a set of guidelines as to what they will do in terms of communicating with global leaders if SETI discovers a signal of extraterrestrial technologies. But it bumps into a whole bunch of questions about human interests that are really not at all related to science and related to a number of other potential concerns that have a lot of political impact. And so it's a very difficult problem. But it is
conversations are happening,
but
right?
It's certainly something that
amazing.
we'll need to figure out and more immediately figure out, given the recognition that there are so many potential habitats in the universe that we now know about.
So I was wondering what your feeling is about the SETI data to date, the radio telescope failure to find anything, with the exception of perhaps some bizarre signal. Maybe you think that that bizarre signal was real, and I hope your answer isn't the following cop-out. They're so intelligent, they're really not communicating at the frequencies that we're using.
Do you know the comic strip XKCD?
No.
It's a online web comic, and some time ago they actually had a comic strip about this very question. It was a set of ants sitting on the kitchen floor. And the one ant says to the other ant, you know, we haven't discovered any chemical trails, and we've been exploring 20 of these tiles. There can't possibly be any other intelligent life out there.
Oh, come on. Do you really think that our technology is so primitive that we're not able to listen to what most intelligent civilizations would probably have some form of communication that we would think through the radio frequencies that we should be able to pick up from 500 million planets within the Milky Way? That when we listen to the whole star system, we don't hear a single
SETI is unfortunately not listening to the whole spectrum. They're listening to a very small subset, selected because they were considered to be probable. But in fact, most of the spectrum we're not looking at. It would have to be loud enough that we can hear it. There's a lot of problems with the SETI search simply because it's such a hard problem to do. And they're funded at a certain level. They have a certain capability. They've picked the things that our intelligence thinks is the most likely. But it's really only a very small subset of where we would ideally want to search.
Yeah, Jill Tarter has a quick answer to exactly your question, being the director of the Institute. She says what we've covered so far is the size of a glass of water compared to the Pacific Ocean. That's what she has managed to cover during her tenure in her search. And we know that there is a lot more to cover. It just technically, whether it's funding or technically, we're not capable to cover the rest of the radio. We were talking, people were talking here about bandwidth and the spectrum for Wi-Fi and other communications, which is getting filled up. Well, when it comes to what SETI is searching for, it's wide open.
So do you think that the one signal that was found, do you think that's real?
Jill doesn't quite think so, so I would defer to that. So I agree with her.
And has your focus on Earth-like planets, has that changed the way SETI minimizes its search?
Yes.
How has that
Jill
impacted?
Tarter is a member of the Kepler team. We are both members of the Kepler team, and what part of the reason for that is that all the Kepler objects of interest have immediately become targets at SETI. So in other words, the SETI search has targeted specifically those stars with planets which are of interest.
Hi, my question was in relation to SETI as well, so we got that started. And I'm wondering, I know SETI is partnered with Harvard University as well. I'm wondering if they have begun to almost cross investigate, as you guys are looking at the microorganisms and any life at that form. Is there any crossover with the electromagnetic radiation that they're looking for, or any radio frequency signals? And Craig, maybe this gets into you with the idea of the gravitational waves as they're crossing through the universe as well. And also, Cassie, for you, on the flip side of not getting anything dirty on the other side, is there anything from the outside that's getting us dirty that you've noticed or that you've looked for?
So the first question first. Yes, as I just mentioned, Jill Tarter is part of the same team I belong to, and we work together. However, in terms of what my closer team and institute is trying to accomplish and what they're trying to accomplish, although we support each other, our research is indeed separate. Searching for technological intelligence requires different set of tools and a different approach than searching for origins of life. In other words, living microbial biospheres on nearby planets. So what we are trying to do with our lab work is really focused on that goal, detecting signatures of microbial life on nearby Earth-like planets. While SETI is, in a sense, trying to find out what are the possible ways in which we could maximize our search for those signals if they are out there. And we talked about it all the time, and maybe Kepler is the first time when we literally collaborated, where Kepler discovered the planets, SETI pointed their telescopes towards them. But beyond that, I think the two searches are focused on two different things.
And is there any more searches beyond the microbial and the electromagnetic radio frequency of SETI? Are those the two main searches that are now going on, or do you know of any other independent searches? Or those
in big picture terms, these are the two. Yeah, because microbial, you could argue about one approach versus another, but it falls in the same category, versus SETI is a completely different category.
Yeah, again, it depends on what we can observe.
Sure.
And those are things we can observe. Relating to observations of what's happening within our solar system, it is certainly true that there's an influx of a natural influx of material to Earth. Cosmic dust falls on Earth every day, meteorites fall on Earth regularly, and they come from a variety of locations in the solar system. For planetary protection, there are only 3 locations in the solar system that we confidently worry about even potentially contaminating with Earth life. These are Mars, Europa, and Enceladus, because those locations are considered to have the potential for conditions that would be hospitable to Earth life. All the other objects in the solar system are considered to be not habitats for Earth life because they don't have the physical and chemical conditions that would permit, physical conditions that would permit the kind of chemistry that happens on Earth. So we don't think there's life on any of those other objects. And that's based on input from the Space Studies Board, the National Research Council, the Committee on Space Research, the best scientific information that we can get at the time. So if we were bringing those samples, so natural influx takes a long time to get from its origin to the Earth. If we're bringing samples back actively, of course, that's a much more rapid timescale, and therefore, if there were organisms present, there's a potential that they're much greater potential they'd survive. For sample return from a place that we don't think there's any life, we don't have any restrictions on what happens to those samples after return. If you want to bring samples back from Mars, Europa, or Enceladus, because that represents a potential introduction to Earth of life forms that might be hazardous, we don't know. There is, in regard to the precautionary principle, a set of international guidelines on bringing samples back from Mars or Europa or Enceladus that requires we contain them at the same level that we contain known hazardous materials on Earth, Ebola virus, contain them in a BSL-4 facility. That concern also is why we wouldn't ever bring them back to an orbital facility, because orbital facilities eventually fall down. You have to put all your technology up there. It's way more expensive than doing those analyses in the lab on Earth where we already know how to do all those processes. Thanks for the question.
Andy?
You know, we're at the end of the time, but this always brings to mind a question for me, which is, you know, I write all the time about sustainability and innovation and the value of science making things better. But so intelligence seems inevitable, evolutionarily, but is it also inevitably self-destructive evolutionarily? This gets at that message from whatever those beings were, you know, beware technology. In other words, we kind of presume, and I've written about this a lot, that we need more innovation, but are we just sort of fast forwarding like a flame to point, is the silence that's coming from those 800 million planets evidence that?
That's one answer, that's one possibility. Yeah. That's why the silence is there, because it doesn't last very long.
Yeah,
maybe that means there's a ton
I hope that's not the answer, but maybe that we'll find out.
I mean, part of the challenge is that technology is just a tool. It's what we do with it that's potentially the problem.
Right. It's in our hands.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, bring up findings that, the humans are 90% bacteria. And there's a lot of recent, evidence that this bacteria is influencing our thinking process, our decision-making, and that and we have a separate genome that needs, that is part of our being, and that this bacteria has high intelligence. They, the way that bacteria slime, the way it moves, the way it researches its environment. So the idea of what intelligence is and what we are and who we are and what we're looking for in the universe pre-life forms, the amino acids prior to bacteria, and the question of what intelligence is, I think that adds a whole other spin on it. So I'm wondering if you all are working with the biologists, researching this territory, since it's really, the findings are so new.
Well, I am a biologist, and sure, yeah. So the observation, the documentation that we've recently been getting that the human cells in our body are intimately associated and actually require the microbial commensal organisms in order for humans to exist. In order for all animals to exist, we need, not all, most animals to exist, we actually need the commensal organisms because they produce nutrients that we don't get otherwise from our food. That is a very important recognition. It elevates the concern for planetary protection because, of course, it means when we want to send humans to Mars, it's not just the human cells. Mammalian cells can't survive on the surface of Mars by themselves. But we are also carrying organisms, our commensal microbes, which live within us and support us, but also have potential to survive on their own in the environment. And recently we've shown that organisms that live in your mouth, they live on cheese in the fridge, can also survive in surface conditions on Mars as long as they're in the shade, they don't get sunburned from UV, and as long as they have a few nutrients. So the organisms that form mold on your cheese can actually, form spots on your cheese can actually survive on the surface of Mars as long as they have an umbrella and a cold drink. And this means that for planetary protection purposes, we should worry about those organisms. We do want to make sure we take appropriate precautions, not to let them out and overprint the things we want to study before we have a chance to study those things. Of course, planetary protection requirements for Mars specifically have always been, policy has always been framed in the context of understanding that we eventually want to send humans there. But even when we do send humans, the objective to protect the science and to protect all of our future interests is don't let things out for which we don't understand the consequences.
I just wanted to ask what the difference was between what you're doing in your research and synthetic biology.
Just briefly, I loved your question because yes, that's actually one of our recent focuses, is to try to connect the microbiome research to what we are trying to do, because the signaling between those bacteria, and not only in the human body, but generally animals and plants, where bacteria actually work in cooperation with each other, they produce a lot of small metabolites, the small molecules, and we believe that some of those are detectable because they diffuse in the atmosphere and very unusual compared to geochemistry, which is abiotic. And so in those terms, even a planet with a living technological civilization is still, in a certain sense, dominated by the microbes.
I'm getting the sign that we're out of time. One question, though, more on a philosophical level in terms of, intelligent life. If we find it or if we don't, how do you think, what does that say about us? How will we feel about those discoveries?
I actually don't think we need to find it to have the different opinions that different people say reflect a whole lot about themselves. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
I think it's a major shift in our frame of reference. Our frame of reference now, subconsciously, is that we are special. And our life on our planet is special. And if we discover a lot of other possibilities, I think it will affect a lot of people in a way which is difficult for me to predict, but I can only predict that it will be disruptive in some way. I think in a positive way, but I hope so.
Destroying illusions is not necessarily negative. Absolutely.
Right.
Well, thank you. We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.